Namaste. Psychoanalysis and philosophy. Types of anger. Anger is a strong and feared emotion in us. Like all the other emotions, anger also comes in many shades. It will be very interesting to discuss this topic in detail with our psychoanalysis consultant, Mr. Himanshu Vaidya. Namaste, Mr. Vaidya.
Namaste.
Mr. Vaidya, can we start with what is anger?
One way to look at the psychological world is to look at its functional entities. And functional entities there can be divided into two categories, thoughts and emotions. Anger is an emotion. It is one of the basic human emotions. If we look at 5 or 7 basic human emotions, anger is one of them, which every human being experiences in his lifetime without exception. Anger we experience from childhood to the old age across our life. Anger can be conscious or unconscious. Anger usually is a resultant emotion. It is not a fundamental emotion like the emotion, the motivation for knowledge or motivation for pleasure. In the sense, it does not activate by itself. Usually it activates as a result of some event. Some motivations like desire for pleasure, desire for power, desire for love, they self-motivate, self-activate. So they are fundamental motivational elementals. Whereas anger is a resultant elemental. When a desire is frustrated, anger arises. It is a consequence of some other event, usually a frustration of desire. Anger is also a very feared emotion because it brings not rewards but punishment, some sort of punitive imposition upon us. So we fear rupture of relationship, we fear financial loss, we fear physical attack, we fear a verbal attack, we fear consequences of anger, and therefore usually over a period of our life we learn how not to express anger and repress it. As a child, we express much of our anger. Over a period of our cultural training, usually we start dealing with anger in a different way. We express very small part of it, and a larger part of it we repress, sublimate, suppress, or channelize it into art. However, anger, when it is repressed, can lead to psychological issues, can lead to psychosomatic sicknesses for an individual, and it can also lead at the group level to group conflicts and to the most brutal and uncivilized, savage-like behavior on our part in groups, which we see in wars, which we see in group conflicts. So anger is a very important psychological elemental to be managed, because inability to manage anger can easily result in a savage situation, in violence and brutality, in human pain and destruction. And with the kind of capabilities we have today in terms of nuclear power, technology, and so on, management of our anger becomes all the more important, because individuals and groups who cannot manage their anger can become extremely dominating, brutal, sadistic, and virtually reverse the civilizational gains that we have made. So it is also a binary that we have of destructive anger and civilization. It's a binary between the two. All forms of anger are not equally destructive, but the particularly destructive form of anger, where the moral justification also comes from ideas of nationalism or ideology, that particular flavor and color of anger is one of the most difficult and destructive things which all of us are afraid of, and therefore it is a entity whose management is of interest from a psychotherapist dealing with an individual to United Nations, which is dealing with the world at large.
Is anger same as aggression in psychoanalysis?
No, the two are different. Aggression in psychoanalysis is a wider term than anger. Anger is one particular manifestation of the aggressive drive. The idea there is that there are two fundamental drives, the pleasure drive and the aggressive drive. And the aggressive drive is powers our ambitions. It powers up our ideological movements. It also powers up our art. It powers up our project implementation. In a sublimated form, it powers up many constructive human things. However, one output, one manifestation of that aggression is anger, which becomes or can become destructive to self or others. So the two are not the same. Anger is one particular manifestation of aggression. Aggression has both positive sublimated manifestations as well as destructive manifestations where anger comes in.
What are the different types of anger we come across in our day-to-day lives?
We can classify anger on a variety of criteria, and based on which criteria we use, we get the classification. So we can classify anger as conscious and unconscious anger. Conscious anger, which we know, unconscious anger, which is inside us, but we don't know it is inside us. And that goes into pathology or can go into pathology. Second classification is of sublimated anger and non-sublimated anger. Sublimated anger can do something constructive. Non-sublimated anger is rarely constructive, largely destructive. We can also look at anger from the point of view of destruction. So we can classify anger into that anger which is destructive for others, and second, which is destructive for the self. What kind of destruction it creates? Other destruction or self-destruction? We can also look at anger arising from particular phenomena. So you can say there is one kind of anger arising from the split being open, second kind of anger arising from the Oedipus, and there will be difference in the shades, although largely they look the same. But we can definitely make the classification based upon phenomena. And then we have anger, which is classified based upon what kind of desire is frustrated, resulting in a particular kind of anger. So there we look at classification of desire, that we have desire for sense pleasure, desire for ego pleasure, desire for emotional pleasure, and desire for intellectual and creative pleasure, and desire for mystical and spiritual activities or goals. And any of these desires, when it is frustrated, it results in a particular kind of anger. So when sense pleasure drive is frustrated, one particular form of anger arises. When spiritual drive is frustrated, another form of anger arises. When the emotional drive is frustrated, another form of anger arises. So that is, you can classify desires, and based upon the nature of desire and its frustration, a particular kind of anger comes out. Right? So we can look at anger from this point. There are various types of anger. You can also look at it from an intensity point of view. You can always call it mild, moderate, and severe. You can also call it pathological and normal. There is something called normal anger, something called pathological anger. You can also call it moral anger and non-moral anger. Moral anger arises when somebody does something illegal or unethical, whereas non-moral anger arises in more normal situations. You can also call it relationship anger and non-relationship anger. And you can also call it existential angst versus regular anger. So there are various ways in which we can classify anger. And like all other emotions, anger also comes in all colors and flavors. There is a rainbow of anger, just as there is a rainbow of love. And similarly, there is a rainbow of hate, a rainbow of envy, a rainbow of shame, and a rainbow of every affect that we feel. They all come in all colors and flavors, and so does anger.
Uh, what are the other one or two main emotions which are linked to anger? Like possibly say, I thought of envy. Is it related to anger?
Yes, yes. Uh, envy wants destruction. When you cannot tolerate good outside of you, you want that good to be destroyed. That is how envy operates. But for achieving those goals, anger has to be activated. So envy activates anger for destruction. Just as when the desire is frustrated, anger arises, envy also arises when the desire is frustrated. The desire is to have everything good in the world inside of us. When that does not happen, we cannot tolerate good outside of us, which we call envy. And that envy is a very distinct feeling, very destructive feeling. And envy in turn uses anger, activates anger to destroy the object of envy. So envy is linked very strongly to anger. And similarly, narcissism also is linked very strongly to anger. And beyond uses both these things, the anger related to envy and anger related to narcissism as being responsible for attack on linking and being the cause of many problems in the area of cognitive thought disorder.
What is the life cycle of anger?
Uh, like any emotion, it is generated, it is regulated or expressed, and then it goes down and vanishes away. And usually we see in normal, very early infants, you can see the life cycle, the natural life cycle of anger. The natural life cycle is the moment desire is frustrated, anger arises, and the anger starts flowing in the whole body, not only in the mind, but in the whole body. So the mind is full of anger, the whole body is full of anger, and the striated muscles of hands and legs get powered up and they start moving towards the object of anger to punish it. And they want to destroy the object of anger. And once the object of anger is punished or destroyed to satisfaction, the anger is completely exhausted and it goes away without a trace. It has lived itself out. So from generation to exhaustion and how do you say, uh, ceasing to exist. So from life of anger, birth of anger to the death of anger, the complete cycle happens. It is born, it becomes high, and it is expressed out, starts slowly declining, and it dies a death. So the birth and death of anger happens in a very short time when full expression happens of anger. As we grow up, the life cycle changes. Because of consequences in the real world, we cannot express anger. So the life cycle becomes this. Desire is frustrated, anger rises. Because of consequences in the real world, anger cannot be expressed. So it does not only it is not expressed outside, inside also it does not flow into the striated muscles. It is just repressed inside or somatized in other parts of the body. And that is how the inner core of anger, unprocessed anger, keeps building up. So this is the life cycle of an adult who is not able to express all the anger. Maybe 25% is expressed, but 75% is either sublimated, suppressed, or repressed. And that creates problem as we go along, particularly after 35 years of age, when too much of accumulation has happened. So that is where it comes to therapy, that we actually have to do something, either therapy or some spiritual process or some self-development process, so that an individual undergoes catharsis and allows this anger accumulated inside for 35 years, 40 years to be experienced in awareness, and allows to express oneself, to express, and it flows out, exhausts itself, and dies a natural death, and one is free from that anger. But if we don't do these things, it just accumulates and creates either pathology or reduction in quality of life.
Mr. Vaidya, you have coined a very interesting term, anger, fear, and pain sandwich.
Yeah.
So can you explain this term, and how does it relate to our discussion?
When a desire is frustrated, it is not only that anger is generated, but the sequence is this. When a desire is frustrated, first pain is generated, because the sequence is, there is a desire can be satisfied or frustrated. If satisfied, we get pleasure. If not satisfied, we get pain. And in case we get pain, then anger arises, because we don't like that pain. And a fear also arises. What if this pain happens again? Because it's something we don't like. So this being the sequence, what happens is anger, fear, and pain, they usually go together. One may be more, second may be less, but it's difficult to have situations when each of them is independently present without the other two. But the sandwich is of different shapes and colors. At times, anger is on the top and pain is inside and fear is below. At times, anger is at the bottom, pain is in the middle, and fear is on the top. So it's a three bread sandwich, and the three breads keep shifting from person to person, event to event. But this sandwich usually goes together. And we find that whenever we are trying to explore one, the second inevitably gets into the action, into play, and we start exploring the second also. And the relationship is, because I said, it's a natural relationship between desire, frustration, pain, anger, and fear. At the most fundamental levels, we are creatures of desire. So this is how the sandwich is, and we have to be careful that once we are exploring one part, the other, by and large, is just around the corner in most cases. And we see that even in video recordings of ISTDP, that the moment we try to explore anger, fear comes up, which is slightly different fear, not the type of fear I'm referring to. This is more of signal anxiety. But you can also see normal fear coming up at times. And we always see that the sandwich is very clearly seen in ISTDP video recordings also. And we know even in classical psychoanalysis, the experience is not very different. The three are bound together. And I think we all have to manage this difficult sandwich within ourselves. The management of this triple layered sandwich is one of the central goals of therapy. Not the only goal, but a very important goal of any sort of therapy that we do, or any sort of spiritual activity that we do. The addressing of this sandwich.
How does anger manifest in pathology?
Three primary ways. One, anger directly comes up as anger in cases where we have violence. We have no anger issues, and violence is a problem. Violence to somebody, violence to an institution, but violence is a problem, very overt. And we see that in some of the anger related problems, and we also see in some of the psychosis this thing coming up. Direct expression of anger. Then we have the indirect expression of anger, where anger turns against oneself. And there we see depression, we see self-harm, we see many times in case of personality disorders, the person doesn't want to get well because the anger inside is too high. Anger which was meant towards somebody for revenge could not be expressed, and it's turned inwards, and one is hurting oneself to hurt somebody and take revenge. So anger that cannot be expressed and turns against oneself, that can result in forms of depression. It can result in self-hurt. It can result in losing the will to live, the juiciness of life. It can lead to avoidance of all pleasure situations, and it can also lead to psychosomatic problems. So third is anger can turn inwards, but not go only to the mind, but also go partly to the body, and that can create autoimmune problems uh, and some other problems also of some other organs. So that is somatization of anger, which we see in conversion disorders and also in many other psychosomatic disorders. And last is anger leading to problems of anxiety, where we think it is the problem of anxiety, but actually it's a problem of anger. Because there we are not dealing with regular anxiety, we are dealing with signal anxiety. That the anger is coming up and there is a cover of anxiety over anger. So the moment the anger tries to come up, first the cover comes up. And the cover is what we see. We don't see anger hidden below the cover. And the cover is of anxiety. And therefore we see the cover of anxiety many times can appear as generalized anxiety disorder, at times even as panic, where we feel it's an anxiety disorder, but at the roots, it is an anger disorder. The anxiety is only a cover for it. And similarly, we see in depression at times that the person is in weeping spells. And it may look from the surface that we are dealing with a problem of pain, but actually the weeping spell is a way of escaping from anger and covering it up. The pain is a cover for anger. Again, the sandwich formula, sandwich situation. Okay. So these are the various ways in which anger manifests in pathology. It can also come up in many cases of addiction. Just as many cases of addiction can be because of anxiety, many cases can also be because of repressed anger.
How does anger heal in psychotherapy?
In psychotherapy, the first is exploration of the unconscious, and there we do see and we try to make the unconscious conscious first cognitively. So first is the cognitive recognition and acceptance that there is anger in me towards X, or at least given what has happened, it would be very unnatural for me not to have anger towards X. So logically, the person knows that if these are the events that X has done to me, it's very unnatural if I don't have any anger. So I must have anger even if I don't feel it. Or if the person feels it directly, there is no question for this. There is no need for this uh, logical tour from a distance. You can directly say, yes, I have anger towards X. The first is discovery and recognition. And then comes the catharsis. And based upon which form of therapy you are using, the catharsis happens. It may happen directly or it may happen in transference. It may happen while we are dealing with then and there. It may happen while we are dealing with here and now. It may happen uh, only verbally with slight body movements, or it can be felt fully into the body. It is based upon which technique you use to bring out anger. And there are different psychotherapy approaches. Psychoanalysis has one approach. Then we have some meditative techniques which have their own approaches. For example, there is a very good meditation developed by one of the Osho Rajneesh followers called Viresh, called AUM approach, awareness, understanding, and meditation approach, AUM approach. And one of the two important goals of this approach is to bring out anger and pain. So it is a group therapy exercise to bring out anger and pain. Similarly, many people offer anger management workshops where for 2 days they focus only on anger. And they have a variety of exercises and skills to tap into anger, find repressed anger, accept it, express it, and to the extent be free of it. Psychodrama also does many exercises. Behavioral therapy also has many exercises to bring out the anger. Some people also use activities of gymnasium, of sports, of arts, and so on to bring out anger. So there are various approaches, psychoanalytic approaches, non-psychoanalytic approaches, spiritual approaches, self-development approaches, single emotion focused approaches to bring out anger and do the three things: recognition, acceptance, expression, full catharsis.
What are the difficulties?
Just one more. One thing that psychoanalysis does very well, and ISTDP does very well. It's very important to mention there 2 points. Psychoanalysis does very well when it comes to internalization of good, reliable, stable object over a long period of time. So if we are looking at anger arising from split being open, or lack of internalization of good object, or unresolved Oedipus, psychoanalysis is very good in this addressing these areas. So if anger is arising from these events, psychoanalysis is very good there. ISTDP is very good in channelizing anger into the striated muscles and holding it there, and then getting into a visual portrayal of expression of anger. So if you have anger towards father or mother, you visualize how you would express that anger, and all the unconscious sadism and savageness comes out. And after that, you feel relieved because what you were carrying inside of you for years is now conscious and it has been fully felt, and you can let go. So this is also important, that when we look at the source of anger, and some particular therapy approach is very good in addressing that source of anger. Just as Freudian method is good in addressing anger arising out of Oedipus, or Kleinian method is very good in addressing anger arising out of split open. Similarly, once we know the source of anger, different therapies are good in addressing different sources of anger, and we have to do a mix and match of them based upon the client, and then we can use psychotherapy in that particular holistic way to really heal anger.
Mr. Vaidya, as a therapist, like what are the difficulties that one faces in bringing out this anger?
It's a very good question, because in therapy we often end into a situation where the person knows he is angry towards X. He knows this anger towards X, which is repressed, is not good for him. It is causing him pathology. It is reducing his quality of life, and he is paying a great cost for this repressed anger. And it is not in his benefit. It is not in his interest. He also wants to bring out that anger so that he is free from it and he can lead a good life. So rationally, the person is completely on track, fully knowledgeable, with a strong will to really bring out that anger and be free from it and its consequent pathologies. However, despite this kind of knowledge and readiness and the strength of will, the person is not able in therapy to bring out anger. And this goes on for sessions and sessions and months and at times years. And obviously, we are dealing with some strong forces inside which are contrary and other than the conscious mind. We are dealing with strong unconscious forces which don't allow the will of the man to operate, which is very clear. He does not want to pay the cost of anger anymore. He comes to therapy so that he can feel it and get rid of it. But anger just does not come out in therapy. And some of the reasons why it happens are this. First, the split is open and therefore anger just keeps getting generated there. So even if it comes out in one small installment, the next package is already ready. That is one. Second, when the split is open, there is fear of reprisal. That if you express anger after the session is over, the attack will come from the other side. And in the unconscious mind, there is no recognition of the fact that the other person doesn't know what you are doing in therapy. The unconscious mind assumes omnipotence and omnipresence of the other person, just as a child would believe for his parents. So because of regression, the person feels that the other to whom he has anger towards is omnipotent and omnipresent, and therefore anger does not come out of fear that reprisal will come. Second is the system just does not have capacity to handle those emotions, and therefore system itself does not allow the anger to come up. It requires more time, more support, and more internalization of goodness before this thing can be done. The third is something so difficult is attached to that anger that it is terrifying. And this is more true in case of Oedipal-like situations or pre-verbal situations. Complex is generated pre-verbal, before language started. Things are so horrible and so difficult to get in touch with that anger does not come out. Fourth is guilt, that many people feel extremely guilty about doing it. Even though they are doing it in imagination, the guilt in the unconscious is although as though they are doing it in reality. So excessive guilt. Right? And if they do it, then after the session, they feel very guilty and very low. In some cases, in the unconscious mind, there is a confusion between reality and imagination. Unconscious believes thought is action. They don't realize that thought is different from action. So they believe if you kill somebody in imagination, you are actually killing in reality. And this is not in the conscious mind, in the unconscious mind. In the unconscious mind, there is a confusion between thought and action. There is fusion. And confusion because of this fusion. And this is where the anger does not come out. In some cases, there is very high degree of morality. How can I do this? And the guilt plays a role. And an important point here is that anger not only has to come out, but it has to come out along with ambivalence. If anger comes out in the split position, the benefits are very low, and often we see that symptoms don't go away. There is only a partial relief. The greater relief happens, more enduring healing happens when ambivalence is evoked, is activated, and in the context of that ambivalence, where anger is difficult to express, in such a situation, anger is expressed. And the full cycle of anger being expressed, followed by guilt, followed by pain, and followed by restructuring of the schema, the whole thing is undergone. If there is no fundamental restructuring of the schema, or if after expression of anger, guilt or pain or nothing of that sort happens, the later part of the events are also important. It's not only expression of anger. It has to be followed by either guilt or pain or restructuring of the schema or all of them. When this thing happens, the really lasting benefits happen. And even when these things happen, It is not that in one cycle the whole thing gets healed once and for all. One may have to do repeatedly the same cycles completely for the symptoms to substantially go away. So these are the difficulties with bringing out anger and healing a person when the anger is so deeply rooted in the personality. And this is even more critical and difficult when we are talking of psychosis and personality disorders, where you see everything together. You see fragility, you see early life trauma, you see uh, inability to be a good processor or a good container, and you see very difficult pre-verbal, split related, Oedipus related issues, and huge amount of guilt and fear of omnipotence. So in psychosis and personality disorders, what in ISTDP they call the fragile cases. They don't call all personality disorders fragile cases, but I do. I look at them, all personality disorders, as fragile at some level. So in psychosis, in personality disorders, and in some extreme cases, uh, other extreme cases also, bringing out anger is difficult, and completing the cycle is difficult, and repeatedly we have to do it till we reach the goal of substantial healing or complete healing.
Also, one thought that comes is because initially you mentioned that a person knows rationally that he is angry with some ex, but somehow he's not able to really feel it. He just knows in his mind. So, can rationalization also be an obstacle in bringing out anger?
Yes, you can have any defense working on anger, and hello, hello.
Hello? Yeah.
Yeah. So rationalization, any defense can work on anger, not allow it to come up. It can be rationalization, it can be denial, it can be projection. Any defense can work for denial of anger or perpetuating the repression of anger, because the denial and the repression is not without a purpose. There is fear of consequences. Essentially, we fear anger because of its consequences in the real world or in the inner world. And because we fear the consequences, defenses always are at work.
Uh, once the anger is kind of brought out, as much as it can be in therapy, does the person get healed?
Yes, I would not say always completely, but depending on how much anger is brought out and if the cycle is complete or not of anger, guilt, pain, restructuring of the schema, and whether the anger is brought out preferably in an ambivalent situation. If these conditions are met, and if we do it 2 or 3 times the whole cycle, then substantial amount of healing happens, because not only is anger catharted out, but once the anger starts coming out, we get a wider access to the unconscious, and therefore along with anger, not only the other two slices of the sandwich, pain and fear, come up, but many other emotions like envy, shame, guilt, all of them also come up. So anger is one of the most difficult emotions to come out because of its consequences. So once the most difficult is brought out, other less difficult easily come out. It almost is as though anger is guarding uh, other emotions in the unconscious from coming out at the level almost of the repression barrier. It's a metaphorical way of putting it. I'm not saying it's empirically true, but it appears like that when we see that once anger starts flowing out, other emotions also flow out, and we get a much larger access to the unconscious, and restructuring of schema becomes easy. And therefore, to get to that situation, we have to use a state and tool policy, create a state of transformation. In that state, use your tools.
Now we go out of therapy mode and we talk about anger in like our daily lives. So does life heal anger by itself?
In the long run, it does, because we have no choice. So when we talk of mild and moderate anger, in the long run, life can heal substantial parts of it. Mild almost completely, moderate almost substantially. But severe forms of anger are difficult to go away this way. So what happens there is a severe form of anger not attended to and left to life most of the times gets into pathology development or psychosomatic problems. So unless the person has used some tools of anger management, if not therapy, then maybe spirituality, yoga, homeopathy, whatever. If no tools are used, life can't heal the severe category of problems, severe category of anger, and it does go in the long run into creation of pathology or into a psychosomatic problem. Over
How
age,
do yeah.
over age, we also see that people become more tolerant, more mellow, and more accepting, and they are ready to let go of many things which they were not able to let go in their young age. So what used to cause anger 25 years back does not cause anger any longer. So the generation of anger also is affected. The value system responsible for anger generation also is changed, and uh, the the capacity to bear the frustration of desire also is high, and number of desires also start going down. So the aging, maturing process over a life cycle, that also reduces anger for most people. However, if you have a severe anger, or in some cases moderate to severe anger, uh, it may not get healed in the normal aging process, the normal wisdom that comes with age, or the normal changes which happen with age. And that anger can not only get into pathology development and somatization, but also become a self-perpetuating, self-developing entity. This is very important. Most of the emotions, not most, but at least anger and pain, they have this characteristic of, if they get above a critical measure, they get into the self-perpetuating, self-developing mode. So if you are full of anger towards somebody for a long time, then whatever that person does, you create more anger.
Yes.
The anger has gone into a self-perpetuating, self-developing mode. So that also is one thing that we have to be careful about, that if anger has gone into this mode for anybody, then it has to be serious therapy. It cannot be anything else.
One thing I've noticed in elderly people is there some people who are extremely bitter. So could be that like there is repressed anger over a long period of time which has turned into bitterness with
Yes,
age?
because they are bitter because their desires have been frustrated. They have not got what they deserved in life in their view. And obviously, if these desires are frustrated, anger and pain would be there. So bitterness may be on the surface. Below it would be anger and pain, and below it would be the core desire that is frustrated.
And maybe because of the family support system and all, somehow they have managed through life without going to a therapist, or maybe by religious things or something. But you can see that there is extreme bitterness at the end of their life.
That is true. But in such a situation, we have to look at the opportunity cost. That on a 10-point scale with family support and everything, if you are at 4, you could have easily been in 7. You could have been at 7 if therapy had been taken and you had flushed out that anger and bitterness. So while you are carrying out your life regularly, you are paying a heavy cost, an installment every day for what you are carrying inside.
Yes, definitely. Okay, we come to our last question. How do spirituality and holistic healing engage with anger?
Spirituality does not look at it primarily as something bad. It believes that anger, pain, guilt, shame, all these emotions, whether positive or negative, including happiness, ecstasy, bliss, and all of them. The goal of the universe is that certain quantum of all entities have to be lived out in certain ways. And therefore, anger is one of them. So if you are not angry, I will be angry. If we are not angry, some animal will be angry. But anger has to be processed on this planet in a certain quantum in the process of evolution. So that is the way they look at it. They also look at it in, this is a philosophical way of looking at it. They also look at it in terms of the raw entity and its transformative derivatives. So they don't have a problem with anger so much because they believe sublimation can be done for many constructive purposes. And in one sense, anger also shows the power that is there. It's also a manifestation of energy. Energy powering up anger. Right? So there are two parts, the anger and the energy powering up the anger. So strong anger means huge amount of energy is there in the individual. And the individual is capable of very strong emotions. So they try to sublimate it and use it for a spiritual purpose. And they use sublimation, social work, uh, physical activity and yoga as very important elements in the whole thing. They also use diet as a very good tool for anger management. They use everyday practices of meditation, of devotional songs, of visualization exercising, certain herbal applications, certain energy healing applications like Reiki and pranic healing and many others, certain pranayam type of activities, and very importantly, diet. Diet also is very important in that whole thing, managing of anger. So holistic healing and spirituality definitely look at it as a sign of ego. Anger means that ego is strong. Ego has strong desires which are frustrated and therefore the anger. So obviously it means the person has a long way to go. But it also shows high amount of energy and promise upon sublimation. And there are this basket full of tools that I said, which are put together in a particular format for a given person and his personality. Idle therapy also is a very important component of the whole thing. Using dreams, particularly one practice of, I would not say this is for anger, but in general for strong desires. There is this practice of Swapneshwari in Tantra, and you can have similar practices for anger using by and large similar formats in the psychoanalytic sense. So both holistic healing and spirituality, they look at anger obviously as something to be transformed, but they also see potential of energy behind it, and they use this variety of tools and a complete lifestyle management along with the presence of the guru and the presence of other spiritual seekers and the whole spiritual atmosphere. All of that is used uh, directly or indirectly for addressing all issues of anger and sublimating as much of it as possible.
Okay, Mr. Vaidya, thank you so much for this very interesting discussion. Do write to us at hvindia@gmail.com. Namaste.
Namaste.